Steel tracks crushed the Eastern Front. 3 million men marched toward absolute, inevitable continental victory. Thousands of tanks formed an unstoppable, highly mechanized spearhead. Industrial planners calculated fuel consumption down to the millimeter. Vast treasuries emptied to supply infinite rounds of ammunition. Yet this unprecedented apocalyptic war machine was entirely paralyzed by the freezing wind. Wool was omitted from the ledger. The most sophisticated invasion force in human history froze. Arrogant accountants refused to budget for heavy winter textiles. Logistical trains carried explosives while ignoring basic human warmth. By systematically underfunding basic environmental survival, the Imperial Command orchestrated the mass execution of its own army. Let us examine the catastrophic ledgers of a frozen empire. One of the invasion was fundamentally an algorithm. Industrial output dictated the precise speed of advancing mechanized armor. Generals calculated the exact tonnage of fuel required each day. Quartermasters obsessed over the steady flow of artillery and bullets. Nobody budgeted for the terrifying reality of a sub-zero continental weather shift. Economic planners optimized the entire logistical pipeline for a short, ruthlessly efficient summer military campaign. Textile production was systematically scaled back. Civilian factories were forcefully repurposed to manufacture heavy iron shells. Sheep farming and wool procurement lost critical imperial state funding. Warm clothing simply did not generate immediate, measurable combat lethality. Administrators decided that manufacturing winter coats was an unacceptable drain on the war economy. Les Sabrisseurs. This cold calculus prioritized the mechanical efficiency of tanks over the biological survival of infantrymen. Victory was securely scheduled for autumn. The High Command assumed the enemy would collapse completely overnight. They allocated train space exclusively for gasoline, food, and explosives. Winter uniforms were left rotting inside vast, distant domestic warehouses. Soldiers marched into the freezing void, wearing nothing but lightweight, breathable summer cotton tunics. Arrogance blinded the state to the fundamental economic law of reserving capital for catastrophic environmental contingencies. Then the autumn rains brutally arrived. The dirt roads immediately dissolved into impassable oceans of thick mud. Logistical trucks sank to their axles and completely broke down. The meticulous timetables of the supply chain instantly fell behind. Exhausted infantrymen found themselves stranded in freezing swamps without any thermal protection whatsoever. The disruption of transport infrastructure severed the vital economic artery connecting the front line to survival. The mercury plummeted with terrifying speed. The muddy quagmires suddenly hardened into solid, unforgiving jagged ice. Summer uniforms offered absolutely zero insulation against the biting winds. The human engine rapidly loses heat without proper textile barriers. Men began to shiver violently as their core body temperatures dropped to dangerously lethal levels. Without the physical capital of heavy winter garments, biological bankruptcy became a mathematical, inescapable certainty. Frontline soldiers resorted to absolute desperation. They stripped the dead bodies of their enemies for warmth. They looted peasant cottages for simple blankets and woven rugs. They frantically stuffed crinkled newspapers underneath their thin cotton jackets. The most advanced mechanized military force was reduced to wearing pathetic, humiliating rags to survive. This spontaneous microeconomy of scavenging highlights the utter failure of centralized macro-logistical supply chain planning. The extreme cold destroyed the machinery. Standard lubricating oil froze solid inside the chambers of rifles. Tank engines refused to start without fires lit beneath them. Optical sights on artillery pieces shattered under the extreme contraction. Billions of dollars in state-of-the-art weaponry became completely useless metal sculptures buried in the snow. The Empire invested entirely in offensive mechanical assets. while completely ignoring the necessary environmental operating conditions. The railways collapsed under the frost. Locomotive boilers burst as the unpurified water froze and expanded. The rail network was entirely incompatible with wider enemy tracks. Trains piled up at the borders, unable to move forward. Vital shipments of winter coats sat completely paralyzed thousands of miles away from the dying men. A massive bottleneck in logistical throughput rendered vast domestic stockpiles practically non-existent on the battlefield. Generals faced a brutal logistical choice. A single train could carry either heavy ammunition or coats. Commanders under intense political pressure constantly demanded more artillery shells. They believed firepower alone could break the freezing military stalemate. Consequently, they explicitly ordered supply trains to leave the life-saving winter clothing completely behind. This conscious administrative decision deliberately sacrificed the physical integrity of the labor force for munitions. Frostbite swept through the front lines. Fingers and toes turned black and slowly died from exposure. Field hospitals were completely overwhelmed by thousands of freezing casualties. Surgeons amputated limbs using rusted saws without any basic anesthetics. Young, capable laborers were permanently mutilated simply because the state refused to buy them sweaters. The staggering long-term medical costs completely dwarfed the short-term financial savings of halting textile production. Freezing bodies demand massively increased calories. Soldiers burned energy rapidly, just trying to generate body heat. But the frozen supply lines could not deliver enough rations. Canned food froze as solid as bricks and became inedible. Starvation compounded the hypothermia, accelerating the systemic biological collapse of the entire frontline army. A catastrophic failure in energy logistics created a deadly, compounding cycle of physical and thermodynamic ruin. Horses died by the absolute thousands. Despite the tanks, logistics still relied heavily on draft animals. The freezing temperatures and massive lack of fodder decimated herds. Without horses, the heavy artillery and supply wagons remained paralyzed. Soldiers wept as they slaughtered their starving animals to secure a few pounds of frozen meat. The destruction of this primitive transport capital further paralyzed an already crippled, overextended military supply chain. Morale shattered beneath the icy wind. Men realized their government had completely abandoned them to die. Discipline eroded as individual survival superseded coordinated military tactical objectives. The majestic myth of imperial invincibility froze in the trenches. The profound psychological betrayal broke the fighting spirit of men who had previously conquered nations. When a state fails to provide the basic economic necessities of life, the social contract dissolves. The enemy utilized localized, primitive logistics. They wore heavily padded cotton jackets and thick felt boots. Their weapons were specifically designed with loose tolerances for ice, and they used simple sleds that glided easily over the snowdrifts. The supposedly inferior agrarian nation effortlessly outmaneuvered the freezing, paralyzed remnants of the industrial superpower. Technological sophistication becomes a massive strategic liability when it is totally decoupled from environmental realities. The offensive halted completely in December. The freezing army was forced into a desperate defensive posture. They could not dig trenches into the rock-hard, frozen earth. They blasted craters with explosives just to bury their dead. Hundreds of thousands of men huddled together in shallow holes, waiting for a silent, freezing death. The entire military campaign shifted from territorial acquisition to simple, brutal, and costly biological preservation. The ledgers were written in blood. More soldiers fell to the weather than to enemy bullets. The invincible military machine was dismantled by a missing garment. A minor budgetary oversight changed the entire course of human history. The ultimate failure of the invasion was not a tactical defeat, but a monumental accounting error. Ignoring the microeconomics of human warmth destroyed the macro-strategic ambitions of a continent-spanning, militarized empire. The supply chain finally snapped completely. The overextended railway network suffered a catastrophic, absolute mechanical failure. Freezing temperatures shattered the brittle steel of the locomotive axles. Trains carrying life-saving wool coats derailed into the frozen wilderness. Desperate commanders watched helplessly as their meticulous invasion timetable dissolved into icy ruin. The terrifying climax arrived when generals realized that thermodynamic realities ruthlessly overrule any theoretical military strategy. Advanced weaponry became completely worthless metal. Sophisticated armored divisions sat paralyzed in the deep, blinding snowdrifts. Mechanics could not repair the frozen treads with numb fingers. The multi-million-dollar war machines were reduced to stationary iceboxes. Without the biological energy to operate them, tanks meant nothing. The entire industrial output of a continent was negated by the missing winter textiles. An empire's massive capital investment in offensive iron was instantly liquidated by a severe environmental deficit. The human engine simply froze solid. Men collapsed in the snow, their internal biological furnaces extinguished. The lack of heavy coats caused a catastrophic physiological cascade. Blood retreated from the extremities to protect the failing organs. A perfectly trained soldier is completely useless when his muscles cannot pull a frozen trigger. The defining climax of this economic failure was the literal, physical freezing of the labor force. The counterattack launched from the blizzard. The enemy deployed fresh troops wearing thick, heavily insulated garments. They glided effortlessly across the frozen landscape on wooden skis. Their weapons functioned perfectly in the negative 40-degree temperatures. The invaders were slaughtered not by superior tactics, but by vastly superior thermal logistical preparation. The defenders weaponized the brutal winter environment, turning the invaders' own logistical arrogance against them. The invincible army began to shatter. Elite divisions broke formation and fled desperately into the storms. Entire battalions surrendered just to access the warmth of captivity. The grand offensive collapsed into a chaotic, desperate, freezing retreat. The logistical network failed completely to extract the wounded men. Hundreds of thousands of freezing casualties littered the retreat, abandoned by a bankrupt supply chain. This catastrophic reversal demonstrated that ignoring the microeconomics of soldier survival inevitably destroys macro-military campaigns. The ultimate ledger revealed total bankruptcy. Hubris and terrible accounting destroyed the most powerful military juggernaut. A missing shipment of wool reversed the momentum of history. The invasion force was mathematically defeated before the winter started. The ultimate price of ignoring basic human elements in economic planning is paid in frozen corpses. When logistical planners completely fail to calculate for the environment, nature becomes the ultimate, victorious general. The freezing steppe holds its secrets. Millions of men never returned from that catastrophic winter campaign. The empire spent generations recovering from the massive demographic collapse. Modern militaries now study this monumental logistical failure with obsession. We remember the staggering loss of life caused entirely by arrogant, disconnected bureaucratic spreadsheets. This frozen graveyard serves as a permanent, haunting monument to the absolute limits of industrial arrogance. Supply chains dictate national survival today. We rely on complex global networks to deliver basic necessities. Algorithms optimize our modern shipping routes for maximum financial efficiency. Corporations frequently eliminate critical redundancies just to increase quarterly profits. Yet the fragile nature of these systems reveals our profound vulnerability to sudden, catastrophic environmental shifts. When modern economic planners prioritize short-term efficiency over long-term resilience, they risk repeating this exact historical catastrophe. Technology cannot negotiate with the winter. We build incredibly advanced machines to dominate the physical world. Society mistakenly believes innovation can easily overcome all natural boundaries. Planners design vast supply webs, assuming a perfectly stable global climate. But when the snow falls and temperatures plummet, nature ruthlessly exposes the fragile vanity of human engineering. A missing shipment of cheap wool proved infinitely more decisive than thousands of heavily armored battle tanks. The true cost is never iron. A nation's ultimate strength relies entirely upon its human capital. Tanks and artillery are completely worthless without the men inside. Providing for basic survival is the fundamental duty of governance. Those young soldiers froze to death because their leaders valued offensive firepower over basic, life-sustaining warmth. The ultimate price of power is measured not in conquered territory, but in the reckless expenditure of human life.